Chief Economist at the MB Fund and MB Super and co-founder of Macro Business, Leith Van Onselen. Morning, Leith. How are you?
G'day, Mike. How are you?
Mate, I'm well. Thank you very much for doing this. There's just so much around at the moment that I think bears commentary by yourself. Let's kick off with one of the obvious ones, and that seems to be the Albanese government versus the Reserve Bank of Australia. This isn't a good look for anybody, is it?
No, it's not. But I think it's something that had to be done, to be honest with you, Mike. So I've been pretty critical of the Reserve Bank, really for several years now, for never calling out the federal government when the federal government does something wrong, or even the states for that matter, and calling out those governments when they make the Reserve Bank's job harder by pushing up inflation. And what we saw last week, I think, was a really welcome interjection by Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock, who basically warned that excessive government spending was contributing to prolonged inflation, which obviously got the pushback from Treasurer Jim Chalmers and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who disputed that notion.
But she's right, isn't she? She's right.
100% she's right. So it's not just the federal government, it's the states as well, as I just said. And basically the problem we've got is we have what a fellow economist calls a burnout economy at the moment, whereby the Reserve Bank has the foot planted on the brake, trying to slow the economy, running these very high interest rates, which is obviously, smashing 1/3 of Australians who don't occupy mortgages really hard. And at the same time as the Reserve Bank's trying to do that, and the Reserve Bank only has one tool to manage inflation, which is interest rates. It's a very blunt tool. The state and federal governments have got their foots planted on the accelerator through their spending and their policies, which is pushing up demand and pushing up inflation. And just to run through those quickly, if you don't mind, Mike, the federal government's basically doing it through three ways. So the federal government's running a record immigration policy. They've pared it back a little bit, but it's still running at incredibly high levels that we've never seen before until last year. And that's effectively pumping demand. And we're seeing that through the housing market. So adding so many people to the economy, it's overrunning the supply side of the economy. It's most visible in the housing market, where we've got obviously rental inflation running at extreme levels. And rents are one of the biggest components of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is how we measure inflation. It's also pushing up demand for housing, which is building up, which is bidding up the build costs for housing, so it's pushing up construction prices. And then we also had the federal government failing to address the East Coast gas shortage via gas reservations. So I've said previously to you, Mike, that East Coast Australia is the only place in the world that exports gas that doesn't reserve any gas for domestic use. And as a result, we pay some of the highest gas prices in the world, which also means we pay some of the highest electricity prices, because gas sets the electricity price. And that's effectively pushing up cost of living and inflation across the entire economy. So that's not just households, it's businesses. Anyone who relies on energy is having their costs pushed up, which is they then pass on to consumers. And then obviously we have the massive growth in the NDIS from the federal government. And just last year, while the private sector economy basically added 0 jobs in the last year, we've had massive jobs growth in the NDIS and those related areas, government-related areas, which is adding to demand as well. And then, of course, on the other side, we have the states who are pumping demand with their record big build infrastructure projects. And those are not just taking resources away from the building industry to build houses, which is what we need running this huge immigration program, but it's also pushing up demand across the economy and also adding to this inflation problem. So it's this sort of burnout economy whereby we need the federal government, the state government, and the Reserve Bank to all be working together to try and take heat out of the economy. But unfortunately, the Reserve Bank are the only ones who are trying to take heat out of the economy. The federal and the state governments are basically putting heat into the economy. And as a result, we've got higher inflation than we should, and interest rates are going to remain on hold for longer than they should.
For quite a while, from what I read. But what do you think about this business of the government deciding to use taxpayer dollars to pay for childcare?
Yeah, look, to be quite frank, I'm personally not for it. I'm a little bit old school. I've had 2 children, and neither of my kids went to childcare. I was sort of, philosophically opposed to it, I guess. For my household, I'd rather, if you're going to have kids, look after them yourself. That's my view, but I know a lot of other people don't have that view. But look, it's one of those things. Whenever you do a subsidy like this, it's got to be, you've got to make sure you do it in a manner that's fiscally responsible, and you don't just want to do it in a way whereby the cost can then just get passed on. So, for example, if you if you increase the childcare rebate by, say, I'm just saying $100, let's pull that out of thin air, and then providers just put up their fees by a similar amount, that there is inflationary. And it's also obviously cost taxpayers and those sorts of things. And unfortunately, that's what happens with a lot of subsidies. So we see it with first home buying grants, for example. So governments give home buyers more money to spend, and then it just bids up the price of housing, and you end up with really not much better affordability at the end of the day, and it's just cost taxpayers a bucket of money. So there's a whole bunch of areas where they have to be very careful when they do these sorts of things to make sure they don't actually add to inflation
And
or
in
pump up demand.
in return for this taxpayer subsidy to the childcare industry, then the childcare industry, I believe, has to agree not to put their fees up at least until after the election.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I suppose if you that is good in a way, in that if the federal government's going to pump money into childcare,
Yeah.
it won't just be inflationary automatically. So it's not just going to be a green light for childcare providers to just put their fees up.
But what about
that's obviously very political, that decision. You're
but
basically
after the election, then anything could happen, and that's what I infer from that. But you talk about your philosophical position. I've been reading some commentary from readers about the stories around this, and I'm with the letter writer who said, "Oh, you mean like the Soviet Union?" I mean, to me, this just looks like pure commie stuff. Everybody gets to pay for childcare. That's so, and it's actually the man himself says it at one stage. This is so women can work a bit more, put more money back into the society. But it seems to me it's all out of balance. If it doesn't make sense financially for you to have both parties in a relationship go to work and the child go to childcare, then wouldn't it make more sense for one of you to just stay home?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's basically what my wife and I did. We sort of shared the parenting. But
Yeah.
look, I must say that my wife and I are obviously in a very fortunate position in that we could do that. There's obviously households who can't if you're a single parent or whatever, or if you're just really struggling financially, you don't really have a choice. But so I guess it's not one rule fits all. But I just sort of, personally, I think we do already subsidise childcare. And we do it to a fairly decent degree, and I'm not sure if just throwing more subsidies at it's going to necessarily lead to better outcomes. And it certainly will cost obviously more in taxes, and it's the same across a whole lot of things. Though we often just throw money at a problem, think it's going to fix it, but it ends up not fixing it.
Yes, there's a Resolve poll out this morning that shows that. Well, there have been polls for a while showing that the government isn't the most trusted when it comes to managing the economy. They won't be pleased with the Resolve poll, and it doesn't look like they're going to get their drop in interest rates no way in the world between now and the next election. So I don't know what's open to them. Smiling Jim keeps saying, "Oh, we have to avoid a recession," but in real terms, for the bulk of the population, they're already in a recession, a per capita recession, aren't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's a very Australia's economy has effectively gone backwards for 5 consecutive quarters in per capita terms. So that means the economic pie has grown because we've had this extreme immigration, 2.5% population growth. The highest in percentage terms since 1952, and in numbers terms off the charts like we've never seen before. And because of that, the economy overall has grown, but per head, we've actually shrunk for 5 consecutive quarters. And once the June quarter national accounts are released early next month, it'll be 6 quarters. And that will end up being the longest run of per capita declines in records dating back to the early 70s. Now, not the deepest. We have had some deeper ones. I think in the early 90s recession was a bit deeper, but the longest. So this has been a really drawn out, long decline that we've had. And for all intents and purposes, yes, the Australian economy is in recession, especially consumers. Households have cut back their spending once you adjust for inflation. And also the private sector economy is in recession. So, as I said earlier, despite the fact that Australia's population has grew by 2.5% in the last year, we've actually only created 6,000 jobs across the entire market sector, is what they call it, which is basically the private sector.
Yeah.
And we've actually shed hours in the private sector, so working less now than we were a year ago. And all our jobs growth has come from government-related areas. So primarily healthcare, healthcare, social assistance, mostly NDIS, also a bit of education, etc. So really, the private sector economy is getting absolutely smashed, and it's getting hammered. And once you strip out population growth, we're going backwards.
It's a grim picture, Leith, but I always appreciate your candor, and thank you very much for coming on the program.
Yeah, cheers, Mike. Speak to you next time.
Okay, Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist of the MB Fund and MB Super and co-founder of Macro Business.